The Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Alawi. Chapter 2 The Break with the Past. Dissenters of the interwar years. In an age when secularism seemed to be entrenching itself irreversibly, there were hardly any non traditional writers and scholars who explored the potential inherent in Islamic civilization to generate the changes needed for the new circumstances. Two who stand above all others in the age when Islam appeared to be receding from the public arena were the poet of the subcontinent Muhammad Iqbal and the Kurd Said Nursi of Turkey, known as Badiuzzama, the wonder of the age. Both were deeply concerned with regaining the self confidence of the Muslim in the face of huge threats affecting the integrity of Islamic civilization and the commitments of Muslims to the legacies of their past. Muhammad Iqbal, 1877 to 1938, is a great poet of modern Islam, whose prodigious talents and insights made him a remarkable force not only in pre partition India but in the wider Muslim world. He wrote in Urdu and Persian, although some of his important philosophical works were actually written in English. Born into a reasonably prosperous Muslim family in Punjab in 1877. Iqbal studied at Lahore College, which was then directed by Thomas Arnold, a sympathetic writer and commentator on Islam. Later, Iqbal attended the Cambridge University and was awarded a doctorate by Munich University for his work on Persian metaphysics. He was greatly impressed by the dynamism of the West, contrasting it to the passivity that seemed to prevail in the Muslim world. But although his experiences in Europe were formative, he was not an uncritical absorber of the most fashionable trends in the Western philosophy. It has often been claimed that Iqbal was influenced by the likes of Nietzsche, Bergson, and Whitehead, but this does not stand up to critical scrutiny. In many ways, he was condescending to Western philosophy, seeing it as inferior to the insights on human condition emanating from Islam's own heritage. He wrote to Reinhold Nicholson, the celebrated Cambridge scholar of Islam, that his ideas were rooted in the light of the Quran and the Muslim Sufis and thinkers. Iqbal's philosophy unfolded in his great poems written between 1909 and 1932, Asrar-e-Khudi, The Secrets of the Self, and Javed Nama, The Book of Immortality, written in Persian, and Bale Jibril, The Wings of Gabriel, Shikwa, The Complaint, and Jawab-e Shikwa, The Reply to the Complaint, written in Urdu, as well as in his philosophical prose work in English, The Reconstruction of the Religious Thought in Islam. His writings in Persian were partly meant to reach the wider Islamic audience than that of the Muslims of India alone. Later, his writings would be increasingly directed at the Muslim Indians as he joined others in crafting a political future for them. Iqbal's poetry was a reflection of his own personal philosophy relating to the dynamic individual who seeks realization through a constantly ascending arc of action directed towards the infinite goodness that is God. While Sufism sought the immersion of the self in the divine oneness, Iqbal inverted the formula whereby the destiny of human being is to find fulfillment not in immersion but in the realization of God's absolute uniqueness through the uniqueness of the individual. The divine attribute of Allah's uniqueness therefore becomes a template for the dynamic individual, catalyzing all other attributes which are then manifested in such an individual. Thus, creativity, innovation, wisdom, and justice, which are subsidiary attributes of God's uniqueness, are manifested in ever greater degrees as the individual dynamically seeks to realize his or her individuality. The passage of time becomes a series of ever more expansive possibilities as the individual proceeds along the creative path. History comes to be connected to the actions of the dynamic individuals and imbued with moral content to the extent that it generates an enhancement of the godly virtues. Iqbal believed that it was Islam that provided both the moral and spiritual foundation for the dynamic individual. The dynamism must also be responsible and bound by the outer constraints on the individual action provided by the Sharia to ensure that the pathway to self realization is not chaotic or socially destructive. Iqbal's vision is not that of an unbound Prometheus, but rather of a Prometheus who willingly constrains his actions within a set of overarching moral and spiritual imperatives. Therefore, acknowledgement of change is fundamental not only to Iqbal's theory of dynamic individual, but also to the meaning of human purpose. The corollary is that change becomes desirable and legitimate if it is initiated by the dynamic individual acting within the framework of Islam. Iqbal saw Islamic history as the unfolding of actions of inspired individuals, starting from the first, the Prophet Muhammad, whom he linked to the Sufi notion of the perfect human, complete in his clear reflection of all the virtues of the good. Pencil of self limed 102 days in order to achieve the dawn of a single tomorrow. Its flames burned 100 Abrahams, that the lamp of one Muhammad might be lighted. Ali, the fourth of the rightly guided caliphs and the first Imam of the Shia, also features prominently in Iqbal's pantheon of perfected beings who reach spiritual attainment by an irresistible drive for action. The pith of life is contained in action. The delight in creation is the law of life. Arise and create a new world. Iqbal was hardly a theologian, and his attempts to create a new worldview based on his own, perhaps eclectic understanding of the ultimate purposes of the Quranic message did not quite fit the classical systems of Islam. Nevertheless, it was probably the first modern attempt by a committed Muslim to rediscover the vitality of Islam in the light of the evolution of Western philosophical thought and of the realities of the new West dominated world. As the prominent Islamic scholar Fazlur Rahman noted, his was the first personal effort to evolve a new system of thought that was consciously seeking to be authentic in Islamic terms, as authentic in its own way as, say, the medieval theology of the Al-Ash'ari, who laid down most of the main creedal doctrines of Sunni Islam. Iqbal's influence on his times, especially in providing the intellectual justification for establishing a state for Muslims in the subcontinent, has been subject to a great deal of controversy. There is, however, little doubt that his literary, metaphysical, and political concerns framed the main problems of the Muslims in an entirely new light in the modern period. How practical or realizable his philosophy of dynamic individual could be was another matter. But Iqbal tried and to a large extent succeeded in giving his generation of Muslims, especially in the subcontinent, a huge boost of self confidence. In his seminal address to the All India Muslim League in 1930, he laid out the basic principles of Islam he believed in. Islam is itself destiny and will not suffer a destiny, he proclaimed. He resisted the national or racial idea as a substitute for the loyalty of Muslims and took direct issue with Renan's construct of a nation. The national idea is racializing the outlook of Muslims and thus materially counteracting the humanizing work of Islam. And the growth of racial consciousness may mean the growth of standards different and even opposed to the standards of Islam. Iqbal was also dubious about the possibility or desirability of Lutheran style reformation in Islam that would lead to the separation of religion from the public arena. The prophetic experience in Islam necessarily implied the building of a social order. The prophetic experience, is individual experience creative of a social order. Its immediate outcome is a polity with implicit legal concepts whose significance cannot be belittled merely because their origin is revelational. The religious ideal of Islam, therefore, is organically related to the social order which it has created. The construction of a polity on national lines, if it means displacement of the Islamic principle of solidarity, is simply unthinkable to a Muslim. In the same address, Iqbal raises the demand that Muslims of northwest India, roughly the area covered by today's Pakistan, should form a consolidated state of their own. Iqbal created a spiritual universe which combined the apparently contradictory elements that preoccupied Muslim minds for more than a millennium: the issue of free will and that of predestination. The individual in Iqbal's world can only be realized being if he or she strives for perfection through moral action. The individual thus has the possibility of absolute agency if that person fulfills the pattern of divine uniqueness through the dynamically active self. Iqbal's philosophy stands in marked contrast to the accusations of passivity which were attached to the Sufis of Islam's later period. The reality, however, is that Iqbal used the model of spiritual ascent through various stages of realization, which is implicit in all Sufi mystical orders, and he externalized the spiritual drive from an inward to an outward journey. Iqbal's spiritual person is supremely active but also always grounded in the ethical precepts of the religion of Islam. It is a public unfolding of spiritual realization through rightly guided action. Iqbal shifted the focus of his reconstruction of Islamic life squarely back to the individual, whom he treated as the main agent of change and growth. Iqbal died in 1938, 10 years before the founding of the state of Pakistan as a homeland for India's Muslims. His last Urdu poem, entitled Hazrat-e Insan, the human being, included the lines: "This world is an invitation for the human being to look, for every secret is given, an instinct to jump out of its closet. They are the tears of human blood that the Almighty has used for stirring storms in His oceans." It thus ends: "If I am the end of all, then what lies beyond? Where lies the limit of my unending adventures?" The connections between the Muslims of the Indian subcontinent and the Ottoman Caliphate were long standing and deep. The Khilafat Caliphate movement in India started as a call to safeguard this venerable institution from its possible abolition by the victorious Allies in the First World War. However, the movement was more to do with the political organization of India's Muslims, and it was an instrument supported by Gandhi for joint Muslim-Hindu action in the struggle against the British Raj. When the caliphate was finally abolished, this was effected by the radical secularists of the new Republic of Turkey, led by Mustafa Kemal, and not by the British. The Indian Khilafat movement was left high and dry, and its leaders retreated back into their strictly parochial concerns. They could neither reverse nor soften the absolute determination of Mustafa Kemal and his allies radically to overhaul the entire basis of Turkish society and culture and cast them in an entirely Western mode. It was left to a dwindling band of Islamically minded figures working under incredibly adverse conditions to comfort the might of a powerful centralizing state and the iron will of its leader, Mustafa Kemal. The most significant among these figures was Badiuzzama Said Nursi. His life and work crystallized the dilemmas and challenges facing the piously minded as the structures of their world were being systematically dismantled. The course these Islamically minded people followed and the movements they founded played a central part in the survival of Islamic consciousness both in the individual and in the group under the harsh rule of secular, even atheistic regimes. Said Nursi was born in the village of Nurs in eastern Anatolia of Kurdish parentage in 1877. He later divided his life into two periods, the Old Nursi and the New Nursi, roughly paralleling the last years of the Ottoman Empire and the founding of the Republic of Turkey. In the Old Nursi, Said was a precocious, somewhat arrogant young man who delighted in debating with religious scholars. He moved to the capital Istanbul in 1907, partly to secure official support for his project for a university in eastern Anatolia. There, his path crossed with the Young Turks, whose call for a constitutional government he initially supported. During the First World War, he was made a regimental commander on the Turkish Eastern Front, was captured by the Russians, made a successful escape, and returned to a hero's welcome in Istanbul in June 1918 as the Ottoman Empire was facing final defeat. In 1920, while visiting the cemetery of the companion of the Prophet Abu Ayyub al Ansari on the outskirts of Istanbul, Nursi had a significant spiritual experience where he recognized that the old order had died and his old self with it. The new Nursi was born. Nursi's work with Islamic Association and groups and his war hero status provided him with several invitations to Ankara, where the Turkish Grand National Assembly had congregated to chart out the contours of the new republic. Nursi was dismayed by the overt secularism, irreligiousness, and Western orientation of the officers and officials who dominated the proceedings and felt that Islam was being marginalized and even targeted in the new order. When I came to Ankara in 1338, that is 1923, the morale of the people of faith was extremely high as a result of the victory of the army of Islam over the Greeks. But I saw that an abominable current of atheism was treacherously attempting to subvert, poison, and destroy their morale. He would later write, he had several altercations with Mustafa Kemal, finally abandoning Ankara to the new political class. Within a few years, Turkey was remade in the vision of its new leaders. The caliphate was abolished, Islam was disestablished, the Sufi orders were banned, the ulema class was disbanded, Islamic dress was forbidden, the alphabet changed from the old Arabic script to the Roman script, religious education was deliberately ignored, and Islamic law was replaced by European civil and criminal codes. The destruction of Islam's presence in Turkey seemed only a matter of time. Nursi began his decades-long work to develop a vision of Islam and an understanding of the Quran that preserved the vitality of the faith for the community of Muslims in Turkey during its times of greatest adversity and danger. The Turkish state was actually at war with the Ottoman past, especially with its Islamic legacy, which flew in the face of the mantra of the new order to be modern, secular, nationalist, and European. The Kemalist state relentlessly hounded Nursi, who struggled in the face of exile, frequent arrests and imprisonments, and incessant harassments by authorities. It was during this period that he compiled the greatest work of his life, which had the most profound influence on generation of Muslim, the Risale-i-Nur, or the Epistles of Life. The Risala consisted of a series of treatises on the Quran. They are not so much exegesis as flashes of insights, allegories, and arguments whose objective is to set out proof for the divine existence and unity. They are addressed to an audience which Nursi presupposes to have been infected with the virus of unbelief and skepticism, or to be enamored with the promises of science and materialist basis of modernity. The work aims to fortify the reader in the light of the positivist and materialist philosophies of the new order in Turkey and by inference elsewhere in the Muslim world to reaffirm the foundations of faith and Islam's ultimate veracity. Nursi was critical of the traditional Islamic schools, the madrasas, and their ossified approach to teaching the religious doctrine. He knew that they would not be able to provide the necessary intellectual instruments for reinvigorated Islam, especially under the siege conditions of the Republican Turkey. His Risale was just an instrument. It would infuse the reader with a spirituality that would reach both the reader's reason and heart. He believed that the Risale would allow the reader to affirm his or her belief in Islam and respond to the urge of irreligiosity emanating from the state and the new cultural and educational elite of the country. The Risale is not political, except by being subversively insistent on Islam at a time when the state had chosen to enforce radical laicite. It was this feature of Nursi's work, together with the fact that circles of followers were using his treatises to continue their engagement with Islam, that drove the authorities to arrest and imprison Nursi on numerous occasions until his death in 1960. The Risale has no particular order or logical structure. It covers nearly the entire gamut of doctrines and creeds of Islam, explained or reformulated according to Nursi's own unique method and style. There are considerable digressions into philosophy, classical Islamic mysticism, musings on the nature of science, and on the Quranic message. Nursi uses the form of questions and answers as a didactic tool to provide proof for his reader for all the axiomatic assertions of Islam and of the Quran, including the miracle of the Quran itself, the ascension of the Prophet Muhammad, and divine unity. The last section of Risale, entitled The 33rd Word, summarizes Nursi's belief that the entire cosmos and the individual point unerringly towards the existence of divine unity. I hope this 33rd word may help an unbeliever to accept belief and that it may strengthen the belief of one whose belief is weak. In many ways, the Risale was meant to be the foundation text for the study circle whose cumulative experience with it would add to and refine Nursi's main arguments. Nursi emphatically denied that he was starting a new Sufi tariqa, which was one of the charges laid against him by the authorities. In fact, he often stated that the time of the classical tariqas had ended, but his work is intensely didactic and is structured so as to be read, discussed, and acted upon. At the start of his exile, Nursi had neither any personal resources nor a large body of followers. As the Risale took shape, it would be circulated among small groups of local people and then laboriously transmitted through hand copies in an early form of samizdat. It was read by ever-growing numbers of people who connected with its message, couched in optimistic, constructive, and positive tones rather than with the author. Throughout this period, Nursi, while not being completely self-effacing, would encourage his students, for that is what he called his readers, to concentrate on the text and not on its author. Inculcating belief in the truth of the Quran and Islam was more important to him than the creation of any political movement or party. He saw his work as one of infusing a new moral consciousness into or remoralizing Muslims as they confronted the tide of aggressive secularism represented by the new Turkish state. They would then assist in creating an environment where Islam and its ethic would gradually seep back into the public space through the actions of rightly guided people. Their duty was to sustain and nourish their belief and not to confront the far superior force of a militantly secular government. As their numbers increased, Nursi believed that Muslims' intensive exposure to Quran and to Islam through his teachings would create a powerful momentum and a force for change. It was a brilliant and inspired mechanism for ensuring the spread of a message through a wide spectrum of small groups, what might be called microstructures, which could coalesce into a movement but which had none of the hierarchical structures or charismatic leadership that guide such mass organization and no identifiable political program. The open structures of the movement were an essential feature of the community that Nursi and his followers envisaged. They were the most effective and durable methods to remoralize individuals and communities. Nursi was not against the secular system per se, which he understood to express the state's neutrality towards contending belief systems. He was against a state which was actively and harmfully irreligious, against secularism as a cult or as a religion in its own right. Nursi's work set the stage for the subsequent emergence of Islam as a social and political force in Turkey and tinged it with its characteristic moderation. The Nur movement, the name given to the groups following the teachings of the Risale, both grew and fractured after Nursi's death in 1960, but its legacy included the rise of the powerful civil society organizations, such as the educational movement associated with Fatehullah Gelun, a Nursi follower in his youth. Parts of the Noor movement organized themselves for political action in spite of Nursi's warnings about the dangers of Islamic political parties in an age when society was not yet reconstituted along moral lines. The Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Alawi, Chapter 2, The Break with the Past, Dissenters of the Interwar Years. In an age when secularism seemed to be entrenching itself irreversibly, there were hardly any non-traditional writers and scholars who explored the potential inherent in Islamic civilization to generate the changes needed for the new circumstances. Two who stand above all others in the age when Islam appeared to be receding from the public arena were the poet of the subcontinent Muhammad Iqbal and the Kurd Sayyid Nursi of Turkey, known as Badiuzzama, the wonder of the age. Both were deeply concerned with regaining the self-confidence of the Muslim in the face of huge threats affecting the integrity of Islamic civilization and the commitments of Muslims to the legacies of their past. Muhammad Iqbal, 1877 to 1938, is a great poet of modern Islam, whose prodigious talents and insights made him a remarkable force not only in pre-partition India but in the wider Muslim world. He wrote in Urdu and Persian, although some of his important philosophical works were actually written in English. Born into a reasonably prosperous Muslim family in Punjab in 1877. Iqbal studied at Lahore College, which was then directed by Thomas Arnold, a sympathetic writer and commentator on Islam. Later, Iqbal attended the Cambridge University and was awarded a doctorate by Munich University for his work on Persian metaphysics. He was greatly impressed by the dynamism of the West, contrasting it to the passivity that seemed to prevail in the Muslim world. But although his experiences in Europe were formative, he was not an uncritical absorber of the most fashionable trends in the Western philosophy. Enough doubt about Islam had been sown in the minds of the people that an arch-secularist, Habib Bourguiba, the president of Tunisia, could have himself filmed in 1960 in the fasting month of Ramadan with a glass of orange juice in his hand. A particularly bilious article denouncing Islam appeared in the Syrian military magazine in 1969, something which had been previously unthinkable. Islam belongs to the museums, the author wrote, and even though the article was followed by disturbances and protest and the author and editor was jailed, this appeared to all intents and purposes to be a trial balloon. If the times were not propitious for burying a religion which was deemed anachronistic and irrelevant, then sooner rather than later such an opportunity would arise again. Of course, matters did not quite turn out the way the apostles of progress and modernity had expected, and for this reason, we have to ask how, in the space of less than a few years, roughly from the mid 1970s onwards, Islam would reappear as possibly the single most significant determinant of people's loyalties and identities throughout the Muslim world. The dormant, apparently fatally wounded civilization sprang to life in ways that no one had or could have foreseen. How could decades of secularism, military cliques, and one party ideological states, strident nationalists' propaganda, ruling groups that fancied themselves to be modernizing educational systems modeled after the West, and increasing integration into the world economics? How could all these factors fail to create an irresistible momentum which could mark the death knell for Islam's worldview? The resilience of Islam, after nearly 2 centuries of unequal engagement with the West, escaped many. It was implicit that the juggernaut of technology and the West's preponderance in nearly every field of human endeavor would overwhelm the civilizational reality of Islam. Islam, as an identifiable institutional tradition, may not last indefinitely, wrote Marshall Hodgson at the end of his magisterial work, The Venture of Islam, published posthumously in 1974. The civilization would be secularized and would survive as one of the creative sources of culture where people had long ceased being Muslims. The historian Albert Horani, who was more focused on the Arabs than on Islam per se, did not veer too far from the same conclusion. Islam could not outlast modernity and ultimately would sink in the face of the new loyalties springing up everywhere. There was no answer to the challenges of modern times except through the framework of the institutions and perspectives of the Western world. It was in the West that modernity arose, and it was there that the implications of modernity on individuals and societies were being addressed. Islam suffered consecutive blows in many Muslim lands in the long period which started after the First World War and culminated in the 1970s. The state was recast in any which form without any popular sanction. The decision to expropriate agricultural land or to abolish religious foundations undermined the economic basis of Islamic institutions. Muslims were taught that they were now uniquely Arabs or Turks or Iranians, and that they should attach greater or even exclusive loyalty to these ethnicities because that was the way into joining the ranks of the rich and powerful. Their education would be managed so as to inculcate in them the new definitions of citizenship, progress, enlightenment, all derived from the prevailing ethos of the advanced countries. However, the mechanisms for affecting individuals and managing their transformations so as to make them fit with the outer schema of things were both crude and ill judged. The recovery of Islam in people's consciousness is only partly due to the failure of the systems which replaced Islamic polity and later the colonial territories to offer a modicum of continuity and meaning to their populations. More importantly, these systems never achieved the desired legitimacy in the minds of Muslims so as to be able to realistically replace the older loyalties. 80 years of the most intensive and determined drive to westernize and secularize Turkey could not erase the powerful hold that Islam still had on people's sensibilities. Egypt, as Europe, could not survive the Second World War, and it is now an affectation of a small section of ruling class. Arab nationalism crashed with the defeats of the 1967 war. The Algerian socialist revolutionaries, heroes to the entire Third World, after their victory in 1962, turned into a corrupt and brutal kleptocracy. The Iranian monarchy of Pahlavis appropriated the legacy of ancient Persia to create a new ethos, only to see itself buried by the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Of course, some of the changes that overcame the Islamic world during this period have stuck and are now acknowledged as both valid and meaningful. The nation state is unlikely to be replaced as the primary political unit for Muslims in the short term. Neither will the heightened awareness of ethnic and linguistic differences between Muslims. But these changes will all have to contend with the primordial loyalty that individual Muslims have clearly demonstrated for Islam. The significance of this is clear. The re evaluation of the premises of life that modernity has imposed on Muslims has not yet led to a complete cleavage from the sense of the sacred which the allegiance to the religion of Islam implies. Physical and the spiritual realms that Muslims inhabit cannot be neatly separated, even though modern life seems to make it a precondition that the two are kept distinct. The return of Islam into people's consciousness, which has been dramatically demonstrated since the mid 1970s, should not have been a surprise. Islam never left the people's mind. The return was not caused by the growth of political Islam or by the Islamists coming to power in a number of countries. In many ways, political Islam is antithetical to the spiritualized individual. It is the individual who has kept open the possibility of reaching a new equilibrium in Muslim societies by refusing to acknowledge that spiritual impoverishment was necessary byproduct of material advancement, an equilibrium which did not stray far from the spiritual dimensions of Islam. The French essayist and novelist Julien Benda wrote a short tract in 1927 entitled Trahison des Clercs, the betrayal of the intellectuals, about the failure of the Europe's intellectual elites to stem the growth of extreme nationalism and militarism in the interwar years. He accused them of abandoning the ideals of their vocation and immersing themselves in politicizing through theories of race, nation, and class. An equivalent charge might easily be laid at the feet of the Muslim intellectual class, but the sources of Western culture were at best superficially understood by this class. There was a constant tension between their adoption of the mode of thought and analysis of the Occidental mind and the harsh realities of the political, cultural, and economic dependence of their countries. The drift from Islam was often accompanied by a belated recognition of the merits of the civilization itself, especially when Islamic themes of justice and equality appeared more recent and more certain than their Western counterparts. Islamic socialism, that strange hybrid which achieved a brief prominence in the 1950s and 1960s, was just such an attempt to merge the preeminently Western notion of socialism with Islam's egalitarian drive. Even the greater westernizer Taha Hussein would revise some of his theories as Europe descended into war when he took a renewed interest in Islam's potential for human renewal and reform. The age when the verities of Islam faced their most concerted questioning lasted roughly from the end of the First World War in the to the mid of 1970s, the Islamic world was coming under sustained assault from nearly all points of the compass. Islamic civilizational space had already been disrupted in the 19th century by colonial expansion and conquest. And the period after the First World War started when with the dismantling of its last empire, the Ottoman state. In rapid order, the modern world encroached on the minds, hearts, and perspective of people. New ways of thinking forced themselves on the Muslim mind, eliciting a huge spectrum of responses from total rejection to bewilderment to enthusiastic adoption. It was the likes of Iqbal and Said Nursi that strove to redefine the parameters of a response which they believe was grounded in an authentic understanding of Islam. The heroic model of Iqbal's inspired individual and the remoralized community of Nursi. Both were emblematic of their time. Iqbal sought to regain the Muslims' self confidence as he or she saw the power and grandeur of the past and compared it to the abject realities of the present state of dependency, foreign control, and marginalization. Nursi confronted a different challenge, not so much the enemy without as the enemy within, the cumulative, subtle, and not so subtle pressures to abandon religious faith and belief in Islam as either harmful or immaterial to societal advancement and into the modern world. The echoes of the crisis of those times continue into the present era, but the landscape has changed significantly. The isms of those times, socialism, communism, nationalism, statism, entered and exited the Islamic world, losing their ideological fervor but leaving some traces behind. The new pressures, however, would be equally relentless in the Islamic world.